The night Walter Hudson folded the best hand he had ever been dealt, he lost $800 and gained the only thing he had ever truly wanted, though it would take him the better part of a year to admit it out loud. It was the autumn of 1879, and the town of Larkspur, Kansas, sat low against the prairie like a burr caught in the hem of the sky, a scattering of clapboard buildings and false fronts strung along a single rutted street that turned to soup whenever it rained. Walter had ridden in from Dodge City 3 days earlier with a black leather satchel of playing cards, a good gray gelding named Ulysses, and a reputation that traveled faster than either. Men called him the preacher, not because he had ever taken orders, but because he dealt cards with the solemn calm of a man delivering a sermon, and because he had never once been caught cheating in 11 years at the tables. He was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a face weathered by sun and war and long nights under lamp smoke, and eyes the pale gray-blue of a Kansas sky before a storm. He had fought at Vicksburg as a boy of 18, and something in him had never quite come home from that siege, so instead he had wandered, town to town, hand to hand, letting the turn of a card stand in for the turn of a life he could not seem to settle into. He had not planned to stay in Larkspur longer than it took to win enough for a hot meal and a fresh horseshoe. But fate, as it so often does in small towns with big troubles, had other plans for him. Ella Hale had buried her father 6 weeks before Walter Hudson ever rode into town, and she had not yet finished grieving him when the weight of his debts came knocking at her door instead. She was 26 years old, with dark hair she wore in a practical braid, and hands roughened by rope and reins and years of work that most women her age in the cities back east would never have known. Her mother had died of fever when Ella was 12, leaving her to raise her younger brother Tommy, who was now 19, and her little sister Susanna, who was only 10 and prone to coughing fits that worried Ella more than she let anyone see. The Hale Ranch sat 3 miles outside of Larkspur along a spring-fed creek that never ran dry even in the driest Kansas summers, 400 acres of good grazing land that her father had homesteaded 15 years before, back when the whole country still smelled like new grass and possibility. It was the creek that Silas Crane wanted. Crane owned the Larkspur Cattlemen's Bank, and more cattle than any 3 ranchers in the county combined, and he had wanted the Hale land since before Ella's father had taken sick with the lung fever that eventually killed him. He had made offers, gentlemanly ones at first, over coffee in town, his hat in his hands and his voice smooth as creek water. When those offers were refused, he had found other ways. He had called in a loan Ella's father had taken out 2 winters before, after half the herd froze in a blizzard, a loan Crane himself had encouraged the old man to take, sweetening it with easy terms that had grown teeth the moment the ink dried. By the time the elder Hale died, coughing blood into a handkerchief in the front room of the house he had built with his own hands, the note stood at $900, due in full within the year, and Crane had made it plain, in the particular gentle way cruel men have of being gentle, that he did not expect Ella to be able to pay it. "A young woman alone cannot hold a mortgage note in her own name in this county, Miss Hale," he had told her, not unkindly, the week after the funeral, as if reciting scripture. "The law does not favor it. You understand my position. I would need a husband's signature to renegotiate the terms, or the funds in full, or else the bank must act as the bank must act." It was not a lie, precisely. The laws of Kansas in that year did indeed make it a hard, uphill thing for an unmarried woman to hold property free and clear, a fact that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with men who wrote laws for other men. Ella had gone to the county recorder herself and confirmed it with her own eyes, the ink of old statutes mocking her from behind the glass counter. It did not matter that she had worked the land as hard as any man since she was old enough to walk a fence line. It did not matter that she knew every acre of that creek bottom better than Silas Crane knew the inside of his own bank. The paper said what the paper said, and the paper had been written by men who had never once imagined a woman like Ella Hale might need it to say something different. She had not told Crane she understood his position. She had told him evenly that she would find the money, and she had walked out of his office with her spine straight and her eyes burning, and cried only once she was 3 miles gone and certain no one could see her. It was Tommy who broke first. Tommy Hale loved his sisters with the fierce, clumsy love of a young man who has not yet learned that love alone cannot fix a debt. He had watched Ella work herself thin trying to sell what cattle they had left at a fair price, watched her turn away offers on the good horses because they needed them for spring planting, watched her go without new boots so that Susanna could have a proper coat before winter. He could not stand it. So when one of Crane's men, a smiling, soft-spoken card player named Otis Bell, struck up a friendly conversation with him outside the mercantile and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that a fellow could sometimes double his money quick at the tables in the back room of the Golden Spur Saloon, Tommy had listened. He had gone once, with the $20 he had saved from breaking horses for a neighboring ranch, certain he could win enough to make a real difference. He had lost it in under an hour. He had gone back the next week to win it back, and lost more. By the third week he was signing markers, little scraps of paper promising money he did not have, because Otis Bell was always so understanding about it, always so willing to extend just a little more credit to a fine young man from such a respectable family. By the time Ella found out, in the second week of October, her brother owed $412 in markers to men who worked, directly or indirectly, for Silas Crane. She had gone to the Golden Spur herself, hair loose and coat unbuttoned from the ride, and found Tommy at the back table, pale and sweating, staring at a hand of cards as though it might change if he looked at it long enough. She had not raised her voice. She had simply put her hand on his shoulder and said his name once and watched something in him crumble. "I was trying to fix it," he told her later, at the kitchen table, his voice cracking like a boy half his age. "I was trying to save the ranch, Ella, I swear it. I only wanted to help." "I know," she had said, and held his head against her shoulder the way she had when he was small and frightened of thunder, though inside she felt something colder than any Kansas winter settling into her chest. $412 on top of $900 owed to the bank. There was no version of arithmetic in which that added up to anything but ruin. Silas Crane came to the ranch himself 2 days later, riding a fine black horse and wearing a coat too clean for honest work, and he laid out his offer with the patience of a man who has already won and is simply enjoying the last moves of the game. He would forgive Tommy's markers entirely. He would forgive the note on the ranch entirely. All Tommy needed to do was sit down for one final hand of cards, winner take all, deed included, against a player of Crane's choosing. If Tommy won, the family would be entirely clear, debt-free, land-free, with money besides. If he lost, the ranch would transfer to Crane immediately, deed and all, but the markers would be forgiven and the family would leave with no debt hanging over them, only their wagon and whatever they could carry. "You have my word as a Christian man," Crane said, turning his hat in his hands on the porch while Susanna watched from the window, coughing softly into her sleeve. One hand. Everything settled, one way or the other, by morning. Ella wanted to refuse outright. Every instinct in her screamed that this was exactly the trap it appeared to be, that a man like Crane did not offer such terms unless he had already stacked the deck in every sense of the phrase. But when she looked at Tommy's face, gray with guilt and fear, and did the arithmetic again in her head, and could not find any other sum that left them with a roof over Susanna's head come Christmas, she understood, with a sickness settling low in her stomach, that Crane was right. They had nothing left to lose. Whatever might happen at that table could not make their situation worse than it already was, and there existed, however slim, a chance it might make it better. "One hand," she said finally, her voice flat with the particular calm of a person too frightened to let herself feel anything else. "And I want a fair dealer, not one of your men, Mr. Crane, someone with no stake in it." Crane had smiled, the way a man smiles when he has already anticipated an objection and prepared for it. "As it happens," he said, "there is a gentleman staying at the hotel this very week with something of a reputation for fairness. Perhaps you have heard the name, Walter Hudson." It was, Ella would learn much later, not entirely a coincidence. Crane had sent word to the hotel that very morning, half hoping the famous preacher's presence would lend the whole arrangement a veneer of respectability that would keep the sheriff, and the town, and God himself, from asking too many questions afterward. What Crane had not accounted for, what no amount of careful scheming could have accounted for, was the particular kind of man Walter Hudson actually was underneath 11 years of cards and smoke and long roads. Walter had been sitting in the corner of the hotel dining room nursing a cup of bitter coffee when the messenger found him, a boy of perhaps 14 who delivered Crane's invitation with the breathless importance of a child entrusted with grown men's business. Walter had read the note twice. He did not know Silas Crane from any other cattle baron who had ever tried to use a card table to launder his own greed into the appearance of chance, but he knew the type well enough, had dealt against dozens of them across a dozen towns, men who believed that money made a man clever and cleverness made him honest. He had almost declined. He was tired, that particular autumn, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, tired of smoke-filled rooms and men who could not look him in the eye when they lost, tired of the particular loneliness of being the most trusted man in any room he entered, and the least known. But there had been something in the note, a line near the bottom that the messenger had not been instructed to include but had, out of the plain-spoken honesty of children, added on his own. "The lady said please," the boy told him. "Miss Hale did. She said to tell you please if you'd be willing, because there wasn't anybody else in this whole county she trusted to be fair." Walter had looked at that boy for a long moment, and something in him, something that had been dormant since before Vicksburg, before the war had taught him that fairness was a luxury men could not always afford, stirred awake. "Tell Miss Hale I will be there at 8 o'clock, he said, "and tell her I deal a fair hand or I do not deal at all." The back room of the Golden Spur that night was thick with lamp oil smoke and the particular hush of a town that knew, without being told, that something important was happening behind its closed doors. Word had spread the way it always spread in small towns, quietly and completely, and by 8 o'clock, a dozen men had found reasons to be drinking at the bar out front, ready to carry the news home to their wives the moment it broke. Ella sat near the wall with Susanna's small cold hand in hers, having refused to leave her brother alone at that table, no matter how many times the bartender suggested a lady oughtn't be present for such business. Tommy sat across from a green felt table gone soft and worn at the edges, his face the color of ash, a small stack of borrowed chips in front of him that represented, in the strange arithmetic of the evening, the entire future of his family. Walter Hudson arrived at 5 minutes before 8, dressed in a clean black coat, his cards in their leather case tucked under one arm, and when he looked across that smoke-hung room and saw Ella Hale sitting with her sister's hand in hers and her spine straight as a fence post despite everything, something in his chest turned over slow and unfamiliar, like a wheel finding a groove it had been searching for without knowing it. "Miss Hale," he said, removing his hat, and it was the only time that night his voice was anything but perfectly level. "I understand you asked for a fair dealer." "I did," she said, and her eyes, when they met his, held none of the fear he expected and all of the exhaustion he understood too well. "I hope you're everything they say you are, Mr. Hudson. My family has nothing left to gamble with but this one chance." "Then I'll deal it straight," Walter said, "and whatever else happens tonight, that much you can trust." Silas Crane sat at the head of the table like a man presiding over his own private courtroom, a glass of good whiskey at his elbow, his expression pleasant and untroubled, And it occurred to Walter within the first 5 minutes of taking his seat that Crane did not intend to play against Tommy Hale himself at all. That much became clear as Otis Bell settled into the chair across from the boy, shuffling a deck with the particular fluid ease of a man who had spent far more hours cheating at cards than playing them honestly, and Walter understood then exactly what kind of evening he had walked into. "Mr. Bell will represent my interests," Crane said smoothly, when Walter raised an eyebrow. "I trust that presents no difficulty, given that you yourself will be dealing, Mr. Hudson." That was the arrangement, was it not? A fair dealer and fair cards dealt by a fair hand. It was clever, Walter had to admit. Crane had wrapped his trap in exactly the language that made it hardest to refuse. He could not object to Otis Bell playing on Crane's behalf without seeming to accuse the man of dishonesty before a single card had been dealt. And he could not walk away now without abandoning Ella and Tommy to whatever crooked arrangement Crane would simply construct in his absence. So Walter did the only thing left to him. He agreed to deal, and he made certain, with the quiet, unshowy skill of 11 years at the tables, that every card that left his hands that night was exactly what it appeared to be, no more and no less, because if there was going to be cheating done at that table, it was not going to come from his side of the deck. The game began simply enough. A few warm-up hands to settle nerves and establish rhythm, small pots that Tommy won and lost in roughly equal measure. But Walter watched, and what he watched troubled him more with every passing hand. Otis Bell was good, very good, the kind of good that came from years of practice rather than natural gift, and though Walter dealt every card scrupulously fair, he began to notice the small signals passing between Bell and Crane, a tap of 2 fingers on the table's edge, a particular way Crane touched the rim of his whiskey glass, signals meant to convey information about Tommy's tells, about the boy's nervous habits, the way his jaw tightened when he held a strong hand and loosened when he bluffed. It was not cheating in the strict sense that would let Walter halt the game outright. It was simply 2 experienced predators working in concert against a boy who had never learned to hide his fear, and there was nothing fair about it even though every card on the table was exactly as it should be. By 11 o'clock, Tommy's borrowed chips were nearly gone. Ella sat rigid against the wall, Susanna asleep now against her shoulder despite the noise and smoke, and every time Tommy lost another hand, Walter watched the small hopeful light in Ella's eyes dim a little further, watched her jaw tighten the same helpless way her brother's did, watched her hold herself together through what must have felt like the slow unraveling of everything her family had left. At 11:30, Crane called for the final hand. "The boys' chips are spent," he said, not unkindly, though there was nothing kind underneath it. "But we made an arrangement, did we not? The deed against the markers and the note, one hand, winner take all. I believe it's time we settled this properly." Tommy's hands were shaking so badly, he nearly dropped the folded deed when he laid it on the table's center. The paper that represented 400 acres and 15 years of his father's labor, and every memory the Hale children had of the only home they had ever known. Ella made a small sound, not quite a sob, and pressed her hand over her mouth, and Walter, shuffling the cards for the final deal, felt something settle cold and clear inside him, the particular sharpened focus he had not felt since the war, the feeling of a man about to do something that mattered more than the moment allowed him time to consider fully. He dealt the cards. Otis Bell picked up his hand and did not so much as flicker, which told Walter, who had spent a lifetime reading exactly such flickers, that the man had been dealt something strong. Tommy picked up his own cards and went the color of old bone, his breath coming shallow and fast, and Walter did not need to see the cards to know the boy held little worth, the paper the deed was written on. There would be a betting round yet, the ritual dance of raises and calls that would decide in the end whether Tommy even had the chips left to see the hand through to its finish. But the true shape of the outcome was already forming, inevitable as a storm cloud on the western horizon. And then Walter looked down at his own hand, the dealer's hand, dealt fair and square along with all the others, because a man who deals crooked even to himself is no man Walter Hudson had ever wanted to be, and found himself holding 4 kings. It was, by any honest measure, one of the finest hands a man could hope to hold in a lifetime of card tables. Against Otis Bell's 3 aces, which was what Walter correctly judged the man's stillness to conceal, 4 kings would win every time, would win the deed back for the Hale family clean and clear, would humiliate Crane in front of half the men drinking at the bar who had already heard whispered word of what hung on this hand. It should have been the easiest decision Walter Hudson had ever made at a card table. Play the hand. Win it outright. Hand the deed back to Ella Hale with a flourish and watch Silas Crane's face crumple like wet paper. But the rules of the wager, spoken plainly by Crane not an hour before, had specified that the hand was between Tommy and Otis Bell, with the deed and the note and the markers all riding on that single contest. Walter was the dealer only, not a player in the pot, and any hand he held was merely the discard pile's leftovers, cards dealt to keep the deal even and honest, nothing more. He had no legal claim to that pot no matter what he held. The realization struck him with a strange, cold clarity even as the betting continued around him, Crane pushing Tommy to raise beyond what the boy had chips to cover, offering, with poisonous generosity, to let the boy's outstanding markers stand as collateral for further bets, drawing him deeper and deeper into a hole from which there could be no honest escape. It was at that moment, watching Tommy's hands shake as he pushed his last chips forward, watching Ella's face go the particular white of a woman watching a drowning she cannot swim out to stop, that Walter understood what he actually held in his hands was not 4 kings at all. It was a choice. And the boy across the table, and the woman against the wall with her sister asleep on her shoulder, had already lost everything a person could lose except the one thing that mattered most, which was each other, and the roof that kept them together. Walter set his cards face down on the table. "Hold on," he said, and his voice cut through the murmur of the room with a quiet authority that stopped even Crane's practiced pleasantness cold. "Before this hand plays out, I believe there's a matter of the dealer's obligation we ought to settle." "The dealer has no stake in this pot, Mr. Hudson," Crane said, an edge creeping into his smooth voice for the first time all evening. "You dealt the cards fairly, as agreed, and now the players will finish the hand." "I dealt the cards fairly," Walter agreed. "And I'll finish dealing them fairly too, which means I intend to buy into this hand myself, as is any dealer's right in a house game where his own chips are on the table alongside the rest." It was, strictly speaking, a stretch of custom rather than an outright lie, but no one in that smoke-choked room, not even Crane, wished to be the man who argued procedure at such a moment with half the town listening at the door. "I have $800 in winnings from 3 nights at this very table, gentlemen, and I am putting all of it into this pot, against young Mr. Hale's markers and the bank's note both, provided Mr. Crane is willing to let the boy step back from a bet he can no longer cover, and let the 2 of us decide the matter instead." It was a gambit built on nothing but the particular respect men like Crane held for their own reputations in front of witnesses. To refuse would mean admitting, in front of a room full of men who would carry the story to every corner of the county by breakfast, that Silas Crane was not willing to risk his own scheme against an honest wager, once the odds shifted even slightly against him. Crane's jaw worked for a long moment, calculating, and then, because pride is so often a man's most exploitable weakness, he nodded once, sharp and reluctant. "Very well," he said. "You're 800 against the boy's markers and the note both, but the hand as dealt stands. No new cards." "Agreed," Walter said, and turned his 4 kings face up on the table. The room went utterly silent. Otis Bell's face, for the first time all evening, showed something other than practiced calm, a flicker of genuine surprise as he stared at those 4 kings lying there like a judgment from on high. He knew, as every man at that table knew, that his 3 aces could not beat that hand under any honest reckoning, and for one suspended moment it seemed the whole terrible night might end exactly as it should, with Walter Hudson's winnings carrying the day and the Hale family's debt wiped clean by the finest hand dealt in Larkspur that year. And then Walter did the thing that no one in that room, least of all Ella Hale, ever expected. He reached out, slow and deliberate, and turned his own 4 kings back face down. "I fold," he said quietly. "You can't fold," Crane sputtered, half rising from his chair. "The cards are shown, Hudson. The hand is decided. You cannot simply—" "I can, and I have," Walter said, and there was something in his voice now, a granite steadiness that had not been there before, the voice of a man who had made peace with a decision the moment before he spoke it and would not be moved from it by any amount of shouting. "The wager was my $800 against the boys' markers and the bank's note. I choose to forfeit that wager. The $800 is yours, Mr. Crane and Mr. Bells, to divide as you see fit between you. In exchange, I consider the boys' markers paid in full by my forfeit, and the note as well, as was the original arrangement should the wager be lost. That was the agreement struck before this family's own daughter, in front of half this town. I intend to see it honored to the letter, even if the letter now cuts against you instead of them." It took the room a long moment to understand what had happened, and Ella Hale understood it before almost anyone, her hand flying to her mouth, tears she had held back through an entire evening of humiliation and fear finally spilling free, because she alone had seen, in that single unguarded instant when Walter turned his winning hand face down, exactly what kind of man had just given up $800 and a night of triumph for no reason on this earth, except that a boy across a card table had nothing left to lose, and a woman against the wall had nothing left to hope for. Crane's face had gone the mottled red of a man watching his own scheme collapse under rules he himself had insisted upon. He opened his mouth to argue, to claim some technicality, but the room was full of witnesses now, men who had come only to drink and watch, and had instead watched a Kansas cattle baron try to swindle a dead man's children out of their home, and who now watched that same baron attempt to wriggle out of the very terms he had demanded in front of them all. There was a murmur building at the bar, low and ugly, the particular sound of a town's sympathy shifting all at once against a man who had spent years believing his money made him untouchable. "The terms stand as I stated them," Walter said again, quieter this time, but no less final. "You'll want to honor them, Mr. Crane, unless you'd care for me to explain to the sheriff, and to every man drinking at that bar, exactly how Mr. Bell there came to know the particular way young Mr. Hale's jaw tightens when he's bluffing. I imagine that's a story the whole county would find worth telling." It was, Walter would admit later, something of a bluff itself, since he had no proof beyond his own trained eye that Bell and Crane had been signaling each other all night. But bluffing, after all, was the one trade Walter Hudson knew better than any man in that room, and Crane, staring into Walter's pale, steady eyes and finding no flicker of doubt there, folded exactly the way a man folds when he suspects correctly that his opponent is not lying. "Fine," Crane spat, shoving back from the table so hard his chair scraped loud against the floorboards. "Fine. The note is settled. The boys' markers are torn up. Take your damned ranch, Miss Hale, and I hope the water runs bitter for the rest of your days." He snatched up his hat and stalked from the room, Otis Bell scrambling after him, and the men at the bar parted to let them through with the particular silence of a town that had just watched its opinion of a man change forever. Tommy sat frozen at the table for a long moment, staring at the torn markers Crane's departing hand had flung down in his wake, and then he put his face in his hands and wept, the great heaving sobs of a boy who has been carrying a man's burden for weeks and has finally been allowed to set it down. Ella crossed the room in 3 quick strides and gathered him against her, Susanna stirring awake and blinking in confusion at the sudden commotion. And for a moment, the 3 Hale siblings simply held onto each other in the middle of that smoke-hung room, while the rest of Larkspur watched. And more than one hardened cattleman at that bar found himself wiping at his eyes with the back of a rough hand. Walter gathered his cards, slow and deliberate, sliding them back into their worn leather case, and might have simply walked out into the night without another word, because that was, after all, the particular habit of a man who had spent 11 years learning not to linger anywhere too long. But Ella Hale looked up from her brother's shoulder and found his eyes across that room, and something passed between them in that look, some understanding too large and too sudden to name, and she rose and crossed toward him before he had finished closing the case. "Mr. Hudson," she said, and her voice shook despite every effort to steady it. "I don't know how to thank you for what you just did. $800, and you gave it up for people you'd never even met before tonight." "You said please," Walter said simply, as though that explained everything, and in a way, for him, it did. That's not a word men usually bother with when they're asking a favor of a gambler. Seemed to me a woman who'd say please to a stranger about her family's home deserved a fair shake at the least. "It was more than a fair shake," Ella said. "It was everything. You gave up a fortune, Mr. Hudson." "I've won fortunes before," Walter said, and something flickered behind his tired, pale eyes, some old weight shifting just slightly. "I find I don't much remember any of them the morning after. I have a feeling I'll remember tonight a good long while." He was right about that, though neither of them yet understood how completely. Word of what had happened at the Golden Spur spread through Larkspur before the sun had fully cleared the eastern horizon the next morning, and by noon it seemed as though every soul in the county had heard some version of the story, most of them reasonably accurate, all of them favorable to the young widow's daughter and her brother, and distinctly unfavorable to Sela's Crane. It was not the sort of thing a man in Crane's position could simply weather without consequence. Ranchers who had been considering selling out to his growing herds began quietly seeking other buyers. The bank's other borrowers, emboldened by the story of a man who had tried to swindle the Hales out of their land through a rigged card game, began asking pointed questions about their own loan terms, questions Crane found himself less able to smooth over now that half the county was watching him with new suspicion. It was not ruin, not yet, not by a long measure, but it was the first crack in a foundation that had, until that autumn night, seemed unshakable. Walter Hudson, for his part, did not leave Larkspur the next morning as had been his habit in every other town he had ever passed through. He told himself it was only that his gelding had thrown a shoe and needed the farrier's attention, which was true enough as far as it went, but even Walter, a man not given to lying to himself about much, knew there was more to it than a horseshoe. He took a room at the hotel and told himself he would stay only until Ulysses was fit to travel, and then he rode out to the Hale ranch 3 days later with no better excuse than a desire to see, with his own eyes, that the deed had been properly recorded and the note truly torn from the bank's ledger. He found Ella in the yard mending a section of fence, her sleeves rolled to the elbow and dirt on her cheek where she had wiped away sweat with a dirty hand, and something in the sight of her, capable and unglamorous and entirely herself, struck him harder than any painted saloon girl or Sunday-dressed town lady ever had in 11 years of looking. "Mr. Hudson," she said, straightening and shielding her eyes against the afternoon sun, "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." Ulysses needed a new shoe, Walter said, which was, again, entirely true. "Farrier says it'll be another few days before he's fit to travel far. Thought I might make myself useful in the meantime, if a ranch such as this has any use for a man who's better with a deck of cards than a hammer." Ella looked at him for a long moment, and something in her weathered, wary expression softened just slightly, the smallest crack in the careful armor a woman learns to wear when she has spent years being the strong one for everybody else. "We could use the help," she admitted. Tommy's good with the horses, but he's never had much patience for fence work, and I can't be everywhere at once." And so it began, in the plain, unglamorous way that the truest love stories in that country so often did. Not with roses or poetry, but with a man learning to swing a hammer under a woman's patient instruction. With shared suppers at a scarred wooden table where Susanna's laughter slowly returned as the weeks passed, and the fear that had haunted the house since her father's death began, at last, to lift. Walter stayed on through the rest of that autumn, first for the horse, then for the harvest, then, if he was honest with himself, simply because he could not bring himself to imagine riding away from that particular kitchen table, that particular woman's voice calling him in for supper as the sun went down gold and heavy over the western fields. He was not a natural rancher, not at first. He nearly lost a finger the first time he tried to help Tommy dehorn a stubborn steer, and Ella laughed so hard at his outraged dignity that she had to sit down on an overturned bucket to catch her breath. And Walter found, to his own considerable surprise, that he did not mind being laughed at nearly so much as he had always assumed he would. He learned to mend fence, and to read whether in the particular way the grass bent before a coming storm, and to tell, by the sound alone, whether a horse in the barn was merely restless or genuinely spooked. He learned, too, the shape of Ella Hale's grief, how she carried her father's death quietly, mostly at night, when she thought no one else was awake to see her sitting on the porch steps with her arms wrapped around her knees. And he learned, without ever quite deciding to, the particular ache of wanting to sit down beside her on those steps and take some small portion of that grief onto his own shoulders instead. It was Susanna, in the end, who forced the matter into the open, in the blunt and merciless way that children of 10 years old so often manage without meaning any harm at all. "Are you going to marry my sister, Mr. Hudson?" she asked one evening in November, over a supper of beans and cornbread, her small face utterly guileless. "Tommy says you look at her the way Pa used to look at Ma, and I want to know if that means you're staying, because I don't like it much when people I care about leave." Tommy nearly choked on his cornbread. Ella went the color of a ripe tomato and opened her mouth to scold her sister for such an impertinent question. And Walter, who had faced down armed men across card tables without so much as a flicker of expression, found himself entirely at a loss for words for the first time in longer than he could remember. "Susanna Hale," Ella managed finally, "that is not a proper thing to ask a guest at the supper table." "Well, is it true?" Susanna pressed, entirely unrepentant. "Because I think it would be a fine thing if it were." Walter set down his fork, slow and deliberate, the way he might have laid down a hand of cards he had decided, at last, not to bluff his way through any longer. "I don't rightly know what your sister would say to it," he said carefully, "but I'll tell you plainly, Miss Susanna, since you've asked plainly. I have been thinking, more and more of late, that I have wandered about this country a good long while looking for something without knowing what it was I was looking for, and I have come to suspect I found it somewhere between a fence post and a supper table this past autumn, and I am in no particular hurry to go looking anywhere else ever again." The kitchen went very quiet. Ella was staring at him with an expression he could not quite read, something between hope and fear and the particular wariness of a woman who has learned, through hard experience, not to trust too quickly in good fortune. Tommy was grinning so widely it seemed his face might crack in half. "That's not really an answer, Mr. Hudson," Susanna said, with the terrible patience of a child determined to get to the bottom of a matter. "Are you going to marry her or not?" "Susanna," Ella said again, but her voice had lost most of its scolding edge, and there was something in it now that sounded almost like laughter or tears or both at once. "I intend to ask her," Walter said, looking not at Susanna now but at Ella directly, his pale eyes steady despite the color rising in his own weathered face. "When I can find a way to do it that she deserves, which is a good deal finer than blurting it out over a plate of beans, because her little sister has cornered me at my own supper table. But since the subject has been raised, and since I find I am tired of pretending I haven't been thinking of little else these past weeks, I will say this much plainly enough for everyone at this table to hear. Ella Hale, I have loved you since the night I watched you hold your family together with nothing but your own 2 hands and your own stubborn heart, and I would count myself the luckiest man in the whole of Kansas if you would let me spend the rest of my days helping you hold onto whatever this life sends your way, good fortune and bad alike. For a long moment nobody in that kitchen said anything at all. Then Ella, who had faced down a cattle baron and a rigged card game, and the death of her father without ever once letting herself weep in front of her siblings, put both her hands over her face and began, quietly, to cry. And Walter was half out of his chair in alarm before she looked up at him through her tears with an expression so radiant with relief and joy that he understood, all at once, exactly what kind of tears they were. "You great fool," she said, laughing and crying together in a way that made Susanna giggle and Tommy pound the table with delight. "You didn't need to find a finer way to ask. I've been waiting for you to say something since the night you turned those 4 kings face down and gave up a fortune for a family of strangers. I think I loved you a little from that very moment, though it took me a good deal longer to admit it to myself than it apparently took my 10-year-old sister to see through both of us." It was not, in the end, a particularly fine or poetic proposal, delivered as it was over cold beans and cornbread with a 10-year-old girl crowing triumphantly at the head of the table. But Walter Hudson would say, for the rest of his long life, that it was the finest hand he had ever been dealt, and the only one he had never once been tempted to fold. They were married in the spring of 1880, in the small white church at the edge of Larkspur, with the whole town turned out to see it, because by then the story of the gambler who had given up a fortune to save a widow's children from ruin had traveled far beyond the county line, and folks came from 3 towns over just to catch a glimpse of the man himself standing at the altar in a borrowed suit, looking, more than one witness remarked afterward, considerably more nervous than he had ever appeared holding 4 kings at a card table, with a fortune riding on the outcome. Ella wore her mother's wedding dress, taken in at the waist and let out at the shoulders by the dressmaker in town, and Susanna, now 11 and thoroughly convinced the entire happy outcome had been her doing from the start, walked ahead of her strewing wildflowers with the self-important solemnity of a girl who has never once doubted her own good judgment. Tommy, 20 years old now and steadier than he had been the previous autumn, stood as best man, and wept as openly as anyone in the church when Walter slid a plain gold band onto Ella's roughened, capable hand and promised, before God and the whole gathered town, to love and honor her for as long as he drew breath. It was not, of course, the end of every trouble that autumn's card game had set in motion. Sela's crane did not simply vanish from Larkspur or from the story of Ella and Walter's life together, though it would be a pleasant simplicity to say that he did. He remained, through that winter and into the following spring, a bitter and diminished presence in the county, his bank steadily losing custom as word of his attempted swindle continued to spread, his pride wounded in ways that a man of his particular temperament could not easily forgive. Twice that winter, fences on the Hale Ranch, now the Hudson Ranch as well, were found cut in the night, cattle scattered across the frozen prairie in the bitter cold, and though no one could prove Crane's hand behind it, everyone in Larkspur, including the sheriff, understood well enough where the suspicion properly belonged. It was Walter, in the end, who found the proof that finally ended Crane's ability to do further harm. He had not entirely abandoned the particular skills that had made him the finest card player in 3 territories, chief among them a gambler's patient eye for the small inconsistencies that betray a man's lies, and through that winter he had quietly begun asking questions around Larkspur, in the mercantile and the livery and the barber shop, about other men who had borrowed from Crane's bank, and found the terms of their loans altered without warning after the papers were signed. He found 4 such men within a month, each with a story similar to the elder Hale's, each too frightened or too proud to have spoken up on his own. Together, with the help of a circuit judge who rode through Larkspur that spring, and a lawyer from the county seat willing to take the case for a modest fee, and a great deal of local goodwill, Walter and the 4 aggrieved ranchers brought a formal complaint against the Larkspur Cattlemen's Bank for fraudulent lending practices. A complaint that, once the full extent of Crane's dealings came to light before the judge, resulted in the bank's charter being revoked, and Silas Crane himself facing criminal charges for fraud that sent him, eventually, to serve 3 years in the territorial prison, a sentence the whole of Larkspur agreed was considerably more lenient than the man deserved. Crane's cattle and remaining land were sold at auction to satisfy his debts, and it was, in a final irony that not even the most imaginative gossip in town could have invented, Walter and Ella who purchased a portion of that land at fair market price, the very acreage along the creek's western bend that Crane had coveted for years, extending the Hudson Ranch to nearly 600 acres of the finest grazing land in the county. Ella insisted on paying every penny of the fair price rather than taking any advantage of Crane's misfortune, a decision that struck some of their neighbors as needlessly generous toward a man who had shown them no such mercy. But Walter understood, without needing to be told, that his wife had spent too many years watching injustice reward itself to want any part of building their happiness on the same foundation, even against a man who had earned far worse. There was, too, a quieter reckoning that spring, one that mattered a great deal to Ella though it made no headlines and settled no debts. She rode out one afternoon with Walter beside her, to the small rise of land above the creek where her father was buried, and stood a long while in silence before his simple wooden marker, and told him, in the particular way people speak to graves when they believe, despite all reason, that something of the dead still listens, that the ranch was safe now, that Tommy had grown steady and Susanna had grown strong, and that she had found a man worth trusting with the rest of her days, which was, she said, the thing she suspected he had worried about leaving unfinished more than any debt or deed. Walter stood a little apart during that conversation, hat in his hands, and when Ella finally turned to him with tears standing in her eyes, he simply held out his arm and walked her back down the hill without a word, understanding that some griefs did not need company so much as they needed simple, steady presence, and he intended to provide exactly that for as long as she would have him. It would be a disservice to the full truth of that country and that time to pretend every injustice righted itself so neatly, and Walter and Ella both understood this well enough as their life together settled into its rhythms. The law that had made it so hard for Ella to hold her father's deed in her own name did not change because one cattle baron went to prison. Women across Kansas and the wider territories would spend decades more fighting for the same rights to property and standing that men took for granted, and Ella, in her own quiet way, became something of a voice for that fight in Larkspur, hosting meetings at her kitchen table where the wives and widows of the county came to compare notes on the particular difficulties of a system built without them in mind, difficulties Ella now understood better than most, having so nearly lost everything to them herself. Nor did the land itself belong, by any right older or truer than the law's convenient say-so, to the Hale family or to Silas Crane, or to any of the settlers who had staked their claims across that stretch of prairie in the years after the war. Walter had ridden in his younger years across country that had belonged before any of them, to the Cheyenne and the Arapaho people, driven from those same creek bottoms and grazing lands by treaties broken almost as quickly as they were signed. And he never forgot it, never let Ella or their children forget it either, teaching them, around the supper table in later years, to speak of the land they worked with a certain humility, a recognition that their good fortune had been built. in ways too large and too old to fully repay, upon another people's loss. It did not undo that loss to acknowledge it, but Walter had learned enough from his own life, from the particular grace of a woman who had once had nothing left to lose finding it in herself to trust a stranger anyway, to believe that honesty about old wrongs was worth more than comfortable silence, even when it changed nothing about the deed itself. Their own family grew steadily in the years that followed. Their first child arrived in the spring of 1881, a son they named Charles after Ella's father, a sturdy dark-haired boy who grew up as at home in a saddle as either of his parents had been, and who developed, much to Walter's private delight and Ella's exasperated affection, an early and remarkable talent for cards, a skill his father taught him carefully, along with an even more careful lesson in exactly why a man ought never to use such a talent to take advantage of another soul's desperation. 2 years after Charles came a daughter, Margaret, named for no one in particular except that Ella simply liked the sound of it. A bright, curious girl who by the age of 6 had appointed herself the ranch's chief supervisor of chickens and horses alike, and ruled over both with the same absolute confidence her Aunt Susanna had once brought to matters of the heart at the family supper table. A third child, another son they named Walter after his father, though everyone from the earliest days called him simply Wally to avoid confusion, arrived in 1885, completing a family that filled the ranch house with a noise and warmth that neither Ella nor Walter, in their separate lonelier years before that autumn of 1879, had ever quite dared to imagine for themselves. Tommy Hale married a schoolteacher from the county seat named Rebecca 2 years after his sister's wedding, and built a small house of his own on a corner of the Hudson land, close enough that Susanna, and later Charles and Margaret and Wally, grew up practically as much in his household as their own, the whole extended family gathering most Sundays for a supper that grew, year by year, to require an ever larger table. Susanna herself grew into a sharp, capable young woman who, at 17, announced her intention to attend the new teachers' college that had opened in Topeka, a decision Ella supported with fierce and vocal pride, even as she privately worried, in the particular way older sisters always do, about her baby sister leaving the only home she had known. Susanna went, and thrived, and returned some years later to teach in the very schoolhouse in Larkspur where she herself had once struggled through her letters between coughing fits, her childhood illness having faded, as childhood illnesses so often did with good food and steady care, into nothing more than an old, rarely mentioned memory. Walter Hudson never entirely gave up cards, in the end, though he gave up the gambler's road for good the night he turned 4 kings face down on a green felt table and chose, instead, a different kind of wager altogether, one he never once regretted. He played sometimes still in later years, on winter evenings at the kitchen table with Charles and later Wally, teaching them the particular mathematics of odds and probability, the careful reading of another person's face, the patient discipline of knowing when to hold and when to fold. But he taught them, too, and more importantly, the lesson that had changed the whole course of his own life on that smoke-hung night in the Golden Spur Saloon. That the finest hand a man could ever be dealt was worth less than nothing if playing it out meant taking from someone who had nothing left to give. He told the story of that night many times over the years, at Sunday suppers and county fairs, and, eventually, to grandchildren gathered around his knee, and he always ended it the same way, looking across whatever room he found himself in to find Ella's eyes waiting for his, steady and warm as they had been since the very first night he had seen her holding her family together with nothing but her own stubborn heart. "I had the winning hand," he would say. 4 kings, finest cards I ever held in 11 years at the tables. And I have never once, in all the years since, regretted throwing it away, because I have come to understand there is only one kind of winning that ever really matters in this life, and it has nothing at all to do with the cards a man is dealt. It has everything to do with what he chooses to do once he sees what's really riding on the outcome. Ella, for her part, kept the deed to her father's original 400 acres framed on the wall of the ranch house parlor for the rest of her life, not out of any particular sentimentality for the paper itself, but because it reminded her, every time she passed it, of the particular grace of a stranger who had walked into a smoke-filled room one October night with nothing to gain and everything to lose, and had chosen, when it mattered most, to lose it anyway rather than let a family who had already lost so much lose the very last thing that made a house into a home. They grew old together on that land, through good harvests and hard winters, through the slow, gradual changes that swept across Kansas as the railroad finally reached Larkspur in 1887, and the town grew from a scattering of clapboard buildings into a proper small city with its own newspaper and its own bank, one built, this time, on honest terms. Walter Hudson, once known across 3 territories as the finest and most unbeatable card player any man had ever faced, became known instead, in the town where he finally chose to settle, simply as Ella Hale's husband, a description he wore in his later years with far more pride than he had ever worn any of his old gambling triumphs. And Ella Hale, who had once stood in a smoke-filled saloon with nothing left in the world to lose but hope itself, became known as the woman who had taught half the county's wives that a person's worth was not written in any deed or ledger book, but in the particular courage it took to ask a stranger for fairness, and to trust, against every hard lesson life had taught her otherwise, that sometimes, just sometimes, a stranger might actually answer that plea with his whole and unguarded heart. They were married 41 years, until Walter passed peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1921, with Ella's hand in his and their children and grandchildren gathered close. And though Ella grieved him with the same fierce, quiet dignity with which she had grieved her father so many decades before, she found comfort, in her final years, in telling and retelling the story of the night a tired gambler had looked across a card table at a family with nothing left to lose, and had chosen, in the space of a single held breath, to give up everything he might have won rather than take the one thing that could never truly be replaced. She would tell it to her grandchildren gathered at her knee, and to their children after that, the story growing gentler and warmer with each retelling but never once losing its essential shape, the shape of a truth she had carried with her every day since that autumn of 1879. That the finest hand life ever dealt her had not been 4 kings at all, but a gambler willing to fold them, and a love that had grown, slow and steady as a Kansas creek finding its way to the sea, from that single unguarded moment of grace.